Good morning from Australia. My name is Angela, and I'm a psychologist who met Veronica whilst I was consulting with the United Nations. I have a special interest in resilience and prevention of trauma-related psychological injuries. I'm delivering this short recording at Veronica's invitation. She has asked me to speak of women's health from a feminist perspective, specifically women's mental health. I began my university studies in 1986. I was fortunate that even as a psychology student, I was taught by professors that emphasized that most of what we knew about mental health was based on research into male mental health. Thus, these professors encouraged us to proactively consider the experience of women and question our assumptions. For example, new medications were usually tested on Caucasian males, although there are significant biological differences both in gender, age, and other variables that can influence how that drug is metabolized. A very simple example with a drug that most of us are familiar with is alcohol. Alcohol is metabolized very differently by men and women due to our differences in body fat composition. In practical terms, women may become intoxicated faster and be over the legal driving limit before men are. But the legal driving limit is based on how men are impacted by the consumption of alcohol. This meant in my career I've seen women who were over the limit when they truly believed that they hadn't had sufficient alcohol to end up over the limit. And these women ended up with legal charges. Adding to some of the concerns about the gender differences, and these are just the biological differences between men and women, the prescribing manual, the MIMS, which is used worldwide by many psychiatrists and doctors, markets drugs very differently depending on the target audience. So an assignment we had to do when I was a young student was to actually go through the MIMS, which contains advertising material. Yes, the drugs are advertised. And we found that men were more likely to be marketed antipsychotics, and women were more likely to be targeted for antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs such as benzodiazepines. Some of you who are in my age group may actually remember the large number of women that suffered with drug dependencies due to the overprescribing of such drugs. As a student, a book that was required reading deeply impressed me. It was titled Good and Mad Women, and it was written by an ANU professor, Australian National University professor, Jill Matthews. All these years later, I remember how she wrote that women were admitted to hospital for bucking the status quo. For example, one of the cases she outlines is a woman failing to do housework. And as a result of that failure to do housework, she was admitted for having depression. Maybe she just didn't enjoy doing housework. Maybe there was other things going on in her life. Even in the 80s when I was studying, we were well aware that women carried the emotional load or did more emotional as well as more physical domestic work than men. And this resulted in stress and negative impacts on mental health. And whilst I'd like to think that our awareness is increasing, 30 years later, actually longer, I'm not sure that we really have grasped the real impacts of the societies we live in and how they affect women. So now I just want to touch briefly on the feminist view of mental health, keeping in mind that feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexual exploitation and oppression, not just for women but for everyone. Renee Fabian is a journalist who writes for Talkspace. In her 2017 article, Why Mental Health is a Feminist Issue, she quotes Dr. Mindy Urchel, a professor of psychological science at the University of Mary Washington in Virginia. She says mental health is a feminist issue because women's experiences have often been and continue to be pathologized. She notes that we're more likely to be referred to as crazy, both in daily conversation and in the media. And women's typical life experiences are often characterized as disordered. She also notes that the issue isn't new. It can be traced back as far as 1900 BC Egypt and the use of hysteria to sum up any woman's health issue that deviates or deviated from expected gender roles. And this use of the word hysteria continued well into the 1950s. To this day, it is also my opinion that we tend to blame women for their emotional distress. And despite research to the contrary, we continue to blame mothers for the mental health problems of their children. But the ancients are not entirely wrong. What they did understand is that the mind and body were connected, although how they conceptualize this, of course, we can certainly challenge today. We do know that stress on the body impacts the mind, and psychological stress impacts the body. Now, a simple exercise that demonstrates this connection, I want you, the listener, to just imagine sucking on a slice of lemon. Taste it. Imagine the sourness, the acidity. What is happening? There is no lemon, but most of you will be salivating at this point. Thus, just thinking about our emotional stresses will affect our bodies. The reality is so many women are not merely thinking, but living with a significant emotional load. Where is the empathy for women and the challenges they face? In my clinical practice, I see the emotional load carried by women taking a serious and insidious toll. During the pandemic, it hit an all-time high as women acted as carers on the home front by day and tried to do their jobs online overnight. In my entire career, I've never seen so much burnout, anxiety, and depression. I want to emphasize that their symptoms, while extremely distressing, were not pathology but a natural reaction to their stress, fatigue, and simply being overburdened. Thus, lockdowns made it even harder for women to exercise or find quiet time or space to relax or to deal with this burden, to just think, reflect, and even just cope. Despite this, I do remain humbled and impressed that, despite their distress, so many women made the most of an impossible situation. As an example, as challenging as homeschooling was, many women told me how much they enjoyed the extra time with their children, and also with their families. And many women tried to explore new interests and take up hobbies. And most heartwarming was the way they worked hard to stay connected, despite social isolation and consciously avoiding negative ways of coping, such as overworking and increasing their alcohol use. But the reality is, my observations during the pandemic, difficult as it was for everybody, men, women alike, it was the women that was doing most of the emotional work to sustain their families and their relationships. And the hard reality is that women do have high mental health diagnosis rates. We need to ask ourselves why. Is it biology? Is it the lives we live? Is it because we're more open and honest, more likely to report our distress? Whatever the reason, women do experience and report significant suffering. Now, Fabian gives us some statistics, and I want to add the caveat here, they are from the United States, so they don't take into account the cross-cultural nuances. But as she notes, anxiety disorders are twice as likely to affect women as men. Women experience depression twice as often as men. Women are more likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder than men. Why? Because sexual assault is a leading cause of PTSD. And 90% of adult victims and 82% juvenile victims are female. While men are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, women are more likely to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. This is a highly gendered diagnosis, and to this day it's quite pejorative. It shouldn't be, because it's actually the result of early trauma and perhaps some with genetic influences. But to get such a diagnosis is often, the people are often dismissed and viewed as untreatable, despite all the scientific evidence to the contrary. It's actually very amenable for treatment. Bipolar disorder is considered equally common in men and women, but women tend to have the emotional aspects, the rapid cycling or mood changes, diagnosed at 3 times the rate of men. And of course, 2/3 of people suffering from an eating disorder are women. And finally, and very soberingly, women are 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than men, although men are more likely to succeed when they attempt suicide because they are more likely to use a lethal means. So as I noted earlier, Fabian's essay does refer to US statistics, but in my work with women from other cultures, a woman's stress, distress, and mental illness can be even further stigmatized, and there are many impediments to her seeking assistance. In some countries, women remain property without rights, and maybe not even access to their own financial or other resources so they can access care. And to have a mental health condition is associated with terrible shame and stigma. So some of the theories about why women are more likely to have high rates of mental illness, particularly anxiety and depression, may be linked to the oppression and stresses they face on a regular basis. And I've already referred to that emotional load that women experience that cause negative physical and mental health consequences. There's also been a link between physical safety concerns and psychological distress. And we need to acknowledge that women are more likely to experience sexual harassment, objectification, and violence. And women may have experienced extreme violations of their body, mind, thought, feelings, spirit, and culture, a combination of these. As as quoted from Laura Brown in her book Feminist Therapy. And women are just too often overloaded and exhausted. They're often expected to be a carer, homemaker, lover, wife, breadwinner, all by being perfectly shaped, well-dressed, the perfect mother, and preferably without any needs or desires or motivations or ambitions of her own. Women's work, particularly the domestic work and that emotional work that I keep referring to, is often undervalued. And women do tend to be paid less when they're in paid employment as well. There is an emotional cost to all of this. Fabian's essay ends by outlining why this matters for men. I won't go into it here today because I'm out of time. But I do want to emphasize in this podcast our concern is for all persons and their well-being, regardless of their sex or gender. And I just want to now conclude that we need to challenge some of the gendered mental health diagnoses, such as borderline personality disorder, and how we conceptualize mental health, and how we attribute so much individual responsibility when there's so many complex, both social and group and cultural factors as well. I also challenge you, the listener, to think about the language and stereotypes that you use when you describe women and women's emotional experiences. And finally, I challenge us to learn to value our emotions as an important source of information about our internal and external worlds, and to recognize our emotions' worth as a basis of intimacy and connection and loving, respectful relationships. While I remain of the view we must take responsibility for our behavior and choices, having feelings and preferences and opinions that may not coincide with others does not make us crazy. Kindness, tolerance, respect, and affirmation of a woman's experience, especially her emotional and mental experiences, can go a long way to healing her emotional wounds. So thank you again for the invitation to present today. I hope this short piece is of interest to you.